For over 70 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls harbored a mystery that nobody could completely unravel. Scholars devoted decades to asking the very same question: what do these scrolls actually say? But eventually, somebody posed a different one entirely. What material were they made from? At a research laboratory at Tel Aviv University, a scientist named Odavi and his colleagues analyzed tiny traces of ancient DNA concealed within the dust of a single scroll fragment. When those genetic results were returned, they were left completely astonished. The DNA showed that the animal whose hide had been used to produce that scroll could not possibly have lived anywhere close to the cave where that fragment was found, not a year prior, not even a single day before. All at once, the story behind that scroll grew far more puzzling than anyone had ever imagined. And what that one seemingly impossible discovery quietly uncovered has the power to reshape everything you believed you understood. One of the researchers lifted up a fragment from one of the larger scrolls. Only a small number of these exist, and they are extraordinarily well preserved. But to grasp why that DNA result mattered so deeply, you need to travel back to where the entire story began. It starts with a shepherd and a cave. In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd by the name of Muhammad Ed-Dib was out tending his flock along the shores of the Dead Sea. At a certain moment, he threw a stone into a nearby cave and heard a completely unexpected sound: the sharp crack of something shattering inside. Driven by curiosity, he climbed into the cave to see what was there. What he discovered would go on to become one of the greatest archaeological finds of the 20th century. Concealed inside were ancient clay jars, and within those jars were leather scrolls that had been carefully wrapped in linen and kept preserved for centuries in the surrounding darkness. At the time, he had absolutely no idea what he had stumbled upon, and neither did anyone else around him. He had simply been out searching for a missing goat when he came across that cave entrance. Hoping to startle the animal out from within, he picked up a stone and hurled it inside. Instead, he unearthed a secret that had remained hidden for more than 2,000 years. The scrolls recovered from that cave would later be recognized as one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the entire 20th century. They included the oldest known biblical manuscripts ever uncovered, some reaching back more than 2,000 years. Over the following several years, spanning from 1947 to 1956, archaeologists and explorers recovered nearly 25,000 fragments from approximately 1,000 different manuscripts discovered across 11 caves near the ancient settlement of Qumran. Among them were the earliest known copies of biblical books, including Genesis, Isaiah, and Psalms, alongside community records, religious hymns, legal writings, and apocalyptic visions of the end of days. Taken together, these writings spanned a period from roughly 250 BCE to 68 CE, an era of tremendous political, religious, and social upheaval that shaped both Judaism and the earliest foundations of Christianity. Sheltered inside clay jars and preserved by the arid climate of the Judean desert, the scrolls endured while countless empires and entire civilizations vanished around them. They outlived the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem, the rise and eventual collapse of the Roman Empire, and nearly 20 centuries worth of human history. Yet when scholars finally began to study and translate them, they came to understand that the scrolls offered something far beyond ancient words pressed into parchment. Rather than delivering straightforward answers, these manuscripts raised a whole series of mysteries that would take more than 70 years to even begin unraveling. Where exactly had these manuscripts originated? Who had written them? And what was the reason they had been tucked away inside remote desert caves? For many decades, leading scholars were confident they had worked out the answer. As researchers from universities and religious institutions across the world turned their attention to the scrolls, they examined every detail they possibly could. They examined handwriting techniques, studied the color and texture of the parchment, measured its thickness, and attempted to figure out which pieces came from the same animal hide. They also looked into the language, religious ideas, calendar systems, and literary traditions that the texts reflected. These manuscripts were truly remarkable. They represented the oldest known copies of biblical writings ever found, far more ancient than any version scholars had previously held in their hands. Gradually, one explanation rose above the rest. Many researchers concluded that the scrolls were linked to a Jewish religious group called the Essenes. Ancient writers like Josephus and Pliny the Elder described the Essenes as a disciplined community that had withdrawn from mainstream society into the Judean desert. According to those accounts, they observed strict laws of purity, dedicated themselves to copying sacred scriptures, and believed that divine punishment would soon descend upon a corrupted world. Not far from the caves stood the ancient ruins of Qumran, which seemed to match those descriptions with striking precision. Everything appeared to connect. The sectarian documents found among the scrolls pointed to a tightly bound religious community with its own hierarchy, its own set of rules, and even its own calendar system. Rather than following the official calendar used by the priestly establishment in Jerusalem, this group observed a solar calendar instead of a lunar one. A distinction that pointed to a profound and deeply felt religious divide. For many years, the evidence felt persuasive. The mystery seemed to be settled. But there was a single problem. The answer rested almost entirely on what researchers could observe with their own eyes. And buried within the scrolls was a layer of evidence that no one had ever thought to look for. The scrolls themselves seemed to reinforce the theory. Many of the apocalyptic writings expressed fierce hostility toward the religious leadership in Jerusalem. One of the most well-known texts, called the War Scroll, described a final confrontation between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, the kind of sweeping end times vision that seemed to align perfectly with a separatist religious movement. The conclusion felt almost obvious. The Essenes had settled at Qumran. They had copied and safeguarded their sacred writings there. Then, when Roman armies swept through the region during the Jewish revolt in 68 CE, they concealed their library in nearby caves to shield it from destruction. For decades, that explanation was accepted as established fact. It was taught in universities and seminaries, displayed in museum exhibitions, and repeated in documentary films all over the world. The Dead Sea Scrolls were the library of the Essenes. Case closed, or so it seemed, because this is the moment when the story starts to come apart. Everything you've heard up to now, the Essenes, the desert settlement, the decades-long scholarly agreement, is about to be thrown into question by something no one back in 1947 could have anticipated. The breakthrough didn't arrive through the discovery of another cave. It didn't come from uncovering a forgotten scroll. It started with a conversation in 2012 and a single piece of ancient cowhide that, according to everything scholars believed, should never have existed in the first place. The warning signs had actually been present all along. Even as the Essene theory held firm over academic debate, uncomfortable questions kept surfacing. Questions that conventional methods were never quite able to resolve. The scrolls displayed a remarkable diversity of content. Different versions of the very same biblical books appeared side by side. Manuscripts had been written in varying scripts and by multiple different scribes. Some of the parchments were skillfully and carefully prepared, while others looked rough and almost crudely made. Then came radiocarbon dating. Starting in the early 1990s, tests performed on selected fragments revealed something that no one had expected. Certain scrolls appeared to predate the Qumran settlement entirely. Suddenly, the timeline just didn't add up. And there was another question that turned out to be even more troubling. If all of these manuscripts had belonged to a single, isolated religious community, why would that community have preserved multiple contradictory versions of their own holy writings? Why would one group hold on to two separate versions of the book of Jeremiah, one noticeably longer than the other, with whole passages absent and chapters arranged in an entirely different sequence? For a community supposedly defined by rigid religious discipline and deep devotion to sacred texts, this was hard to account for. The closer scholars examined things, the more the inconsistencies began to surface. Not every researcher was persuaded by the conventional explanation. Over the years, a number of scholars put forward alternative theories. Perhaps Qumran was never a religious monastery to begin with. It might have been a pottery workshop, a seasonal estate, or even a military stronghold. Others suggested that the caves functioned as a kind of sacred storage site, where Jewish communities from various regions deposited worn-out religious texts considered too holy to simply be discarded. These ideas drew genuine interest, but none carried enough solid evidence to seriously challenge the prevailing theory. Then the story took a turn no one saw coming. The breakthrough didn't arrive through an archaeologist sifting through desert soil. It didn't come from a theologian poring over ancient manuscripts. It came from a geneticist sitting down to lunch. In 2012, at Tel Aviv University, molecular biologist Oded Rachi sat down to eat with biblical scholar Noam Mizrahi. As the two spoke, their conversation gradually drifted toward the Dead Sea Scrolls and the difficulties that had left researchers frustrated for decades. Rachi laid out the problem. The collection contained roughly 25,000 fragments, spread across thousands of individual pieces. There were no titles, no page numbers, and often no dependable way to figure out which fragments actually belonged together. Scholars had spent years leaning on handwriting analysis, comparisons of parchment color and texture, and informed guesswork, methods that were helpful but nowhere near foolproof. The challenge was immense. The questions at stake were among the most significant in all of biblical archaeology. Yet the tools available remained limited. Richavi listened closely. Then he asked one straightforward question. What exactly are the scrolls made of? Parchment, Rachi replied, animal skin. Richavi went quiet for a moment. Then he said, that means the parchment contains DNA. It was a simple observation, but it shifted everything. In that single moment, a completely new approach to studying the Dead Sea Scrolls came into being. Richavi's specialty was ancient DNA research, a field that had already reshaped archaeology by enabling scientists to trace human migrations, identify ancient populations, and uncover historical details that conventional methods could never reach. Now he recognized that the same technology might be capable of answering questions scholars had been wrestling with for more than 70 years. The answers weren't concealed in the words inscribed on the scrolls. They were hidden inside the animals whose skins had been transformed into the scrolls themselves. Rachi immediately grasped just how remarkable this was. Scientists had been using ancient DNA to study people, animals, and entire civilizations for years. Yet no one had ever seriously applied the technique to ancient manuscripts. Since parchment was produced from animal skin, every scroll carried a biological fingerprint tied to the creature it had come from. That meant the scrolls themselves might contain information that had stayed hidden for more than 2,000 years. Working alongside Penina Shah, the curator in charge of the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Israel Antiquities Authority, Richavi and Rachi assembled a research team. Together, they set out to attempt something that had never before been done. None of them could have anticipated where the evidence would ultimately take them. But first, a significant obstacle stood in their way. That meant destructive testing was completely off the table. No cutting, no drilling, no removing any material from the manuscripts whatsoever. The scrolls had to stay entirely intact. So how exactly do you extract genetic information from an artifact you're forbidden to damage? The answer turned out to be surprisingly straightforward. For decades, conservators and scholars had been carefully keeping the scroll fragments stored inside protective containers. Over those years, tiny particles from the parchments had naturally settled inside those boxes as fine dust. Most people paid it no attention. The researchers, however, saw something entirely different. That dust held traces of collagen, the protein responsible for giving animal skin its structure. And locked within that collagen were microscopic fragments of ancient DNA preserved across more than 2,000 years. By gathering tiny particles from damaged edges and blank spaces where no writing appeared, the team was able to collect enough material for analysis without disturbing a single word of those ancient texts. The evidence had been sitting there the whole time, quietly waiting in the dust. But locating the DNA was really only the first step. Actually pulling usable genetic information from those tiny, degraded traces would turn out to be an enormous challenge. Recovering DNA from the scrolls proved far harder than anyone had anticipated. The process of transforming animal skin into parchment is incredibly harsh on genetic material. The skins are soaked, scraped, stretched, and dried, each of which damages DNA at the molecular level. The iron-based inks that ancient scribes used can also be chemically corrosive, and then there was simply the weight of time. The scrolls had spent close to 2,000 years sitting in desert caves before anyone discovered them. After that, hundreds of researchers, conservators, and scholars had handled them over the course of more than 70 years. Every single person who touched them could have left behind traces of modern DNA. To prevent contamination, the team worked inside specialized ancient DNA laboratories that resembled high-security clean rooms, far more than traditional research libraries. Scientists wore full protective suits. Air pressure was carefully regulated. Equipment and workspaces were sterilized using ultraviolet light. The researchers also developed strict testing procedures to confirm that any DNA they recovered genuinely came from ancient animals rather than modern sources. They looked for particular patterns of molecular damage that naturally build up over centuries. They repeated extractions, compared results across multiple laboratories, and checked the data over and over again. It was a slow, frustrating process. Years went by. Hundreds of samples were analyzed. Many attempts came to nothing, but eventually the team broke through. They recovered reliable genetic sequences from dozens of Dead Sea Scroll fragments. Then came the moment that changed absolutely everything. When Oded Rachavi looked over the results, one particular detail immediately jumped out at him. The majority of the fragments were precisely what researchers had anticipated finding: sheepskin. That made complete sense. Sheep were widespread throughout ancient Judea, and sheepskin was the standard material used for making parchment. Sheep could comfortably survive in the harsh environment surrounding Qumran and the broader Dead Sea region. But a small number of fragments produced an entirely different result. They were made from cowhide. When Noah Misrai saw the data, he stopped. He had spent years deeply studying the scrolls, the history of Qumran, and the surrounding landscape. He knew that region better than almost anyone else on the planet. For a long moment, he simply sat there staring at the results. Because cowhide parchment at Qumran wasn't just unexpected, it seemed completely impossible. Nestled deep in the Judean desert along the banks of the Dead Sea, Qumran sits within one of the most brutal and unrelenting landscapes in the entire region. And that turned out to be precisely the issue. The problem itself was straightforward, yet had enormous consequences. Qumran is positioned in one of the harshest, most arid corners of the planet. Rainfall across the Judean desert is extremely scarce, and surviving there has never been anything but a struggle. Sheep and goats manage to get by in those conditions. These animals are naturally suited to desert environments, capable of making do with minimal water and thin, patchy vegetation. Cattle are an entirely different matter. Cows need large quantities of water on a daily basis and require broad stretches of land with plentiful grass to graze on. The landscape surrounding Qumran simply could not sustain cattle herds, and that fact carried a significant implication. If any scroll had been written on cowhide parchment, that material could not have been prepared anywhere nearby. It must have been brought in from somewhere else entirely. All at once, the long-accepted theory found itself facing a serious challenge. This discovery didn't just hint that certain parts of the established story might require adjusting. It demonstrated that at least a portion of the scrolls had origins beyond the remote desert settlement that scholars had pictured for so long. In a rather unexpected way, a single cow had poked a hole in a theory that had held firm for several decades. When the results reached the Israel Antiquities Authority, curator Panina Shaw recognized their weight almost immediately. She had devoted much of her professional life to preserving and examining the Dead Sea Scrolls. Very few people had as deep and personal a familiarity with the collection as she did. She went through the findings once, then went through them a second time. Afterward, she described that moment as the instant she understood that everything was on the verge of shifting. Not simply the ongoing debate about the Essenes, but the entire framework through which scholars had come to understand what the Dead Sea Scrolls truly represented. The consequences of this were vast, and the cowhide fragments weren't just random pieces scattered here and there across the collection. They were tied to particular texts and to specific versions of certain books. That is the point at which the story grew even more astonishing, because the DNA was now revealing things that nobody had previously been able to detect. For the very first time, researchers could apply genetics to directly compare fragments of parchment. By examining the DNA preserved within the animal hides, they could establish whether separate fragments had come from the same creature or from entirely different ones. Essentially, every piece of parchment carried its own biological signature. If two fragments had been crafted from the hide of the same sheep, their mitochondrial DNA would be nearly identical. This gave researchers the ability to connect pieces that truly belonged with one another, and equally importantly, to flag fragments that had been incorrectly grouped together for decades. The scrolls were no longer solely ancient written documents. They had transformed into genetic evidence. For over 70 years, scholars had worked to match scroll fragments by studying handwriting, physical appearance, and informed guesswork. Now, for the very first time, they had something far more precise at their disposal. They had genetics. They had biological fingerprints. If two fragments originated from the same sheep, their DNA would be nearly a perfect match. If they came from different animals, the genetic distinctions would make that clear straight away. And that is where the findings became truly remarkable. Take the book of Jeremiah as an example. Within the Dead Sea Scrolls were two quite distinct versions of this biblical text. One closely matched the version that appears in the Hebrew Bible as we know it today, longer, with chapters laid out in the familiar arrangement. The other was considerably shorter, with whole sections absent and chapters arranged in an entirely different order. For decades, scholars had argued over what this meant. Was one version an earlier attempt at the text? Had scribes made changes and revisions to it as time passed? Were these variations simply transcription errors that had built up across many generations? The DNA opened up a completely new angle. Scientists discovered that portions of the shorter version had been inscribed on cow parchment, while portions of the longer version were inscribed on sheep parchment. The materials came from different animals, and most probably from different geographical areas. This hinted at something truly striking. These were not merely two copies drawn from the same textual lineage. They seemed to represent entirely distinct textual traditions that had grown independently within separate communities throughout ancient Judea. Put another way, different groups had been safeguarding different versions of the very same biblical book. That insight transformed the way scholars thought about the scrolls. The evidence pointed toward a reality far more layered and varied than anyone had previously assumed. A reality in which multiple communities had preserved and passed down sacred writings in differing forms. The researchers noticed comparable patterns in other texts as well. They turned their attention to a composition known as the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, a religious document depicting angelic worship taking place within the heavenly temple. Copies of this text had turned up not only at Qumran, but also at Masada, the hilltop fortress where Jewish rebels made their last stand against Roman forces in 73 CE. Genetic testing revealed that several Qumran copies had been written on parchment derived from entirely distinct animals. That result implied the text had been reproduced and shared broadly, rather than being the exclusive possession of one isolated group. The more DNA evidence came to light, the more difficult it became to picture the Dead Sea Scrolls as belonging to the library of a single community. The scrolls seemed instead to be part of a far broader web of people, beliefs, and traditions spread throughout ancient Judea. And then the researchers pushed the investigation still further. They began examining the genetic relationships between the animals themselves. What they uncovered next would expose connections that no scholar had ever been able to detect before. The discoveries kept coming. By analyzing nuclear DNA markers, researchers could sometimes determine whether the animals behind different parchments were genetically linked to one another. In certain cases, the evidence pointed to animals that were siblings, cousins, or members of the same flock. That discovery opened up a completely fresh way of reading the scrolls. When multiple fragments derived from closely related animals, it strongly suggested they had been produced in the same area and within a similar time frame. Essentially, the DNA was steering researchers toward particular centers where parchment had been manufactured and manuscripts had been produced. But yet another pattern then surfaced. Clusters of genetically related parchments appeared alongside fragments that had absolutely no biological link to one another. Some had originated from entirely different animals, different herds, and very likely different regions altogether. There was no common genetic thread connecting them. The implications of this were enormous. The collection did not appear to have grown out of a single workshop or one unified community producing texts in a single location. Rather, the evidence indicated the scrolls had been gathered from many different sources, representing distinct communities, separate traditions, and varying periods of history. What had once appeared to be a unified library now looked much more like an archive assembled from countless different places. At that point, the long-standing Essene library theory did not simply develop a few cracks. Its very foundation began to crumble. A new portrait of the ancient world was taking shape, one rich with many different voices, rather than just a single one. The DNA evidence suggests the Dead Sea Scrolls may have originated among numerous Jewish communities spread across Judea, rather than from one solitary and isolated sect. The caves near Qumran may have functioned as a sacred place of preservation, where important texts were carefully stored rather than abandoned. So, the scrolls turn out to be not the library of a single group, but rather a gathering of many traditions, beliefs, and versions of Scripture assembled in one location. The cowhide fragments demonstrated that certain texts had traveled from faraway regions into the Judean desert, uncovering a connected web of communities exchanging ideas and sacred writings. For those who study the Bible, the implications run incredibly deep. Separate communities preserved distinct versions of books, such as Jeremiah, Genesis, and Psalms, making it clear that the biblical canon was still being shaped. The DNA evidence confirms that the world of Jesus was one of lively religious debate, varied interpretations, and competing visions of faith, a world the scrolls themselves reflect back to us. Most striking of all, the evidence had been sitting in plain sight for decades, hidden away in microscopic traces of dust. By analyzing DNA preserved within the animal skins of the scrolls, researchers uncovered a story that nobody had anticipated. The Dead Sea Scrolls were never simply the library of one isolated community. They were the voices of many different groups, each carrying their own traditions, beliefs, and versions of sacred scripture. For generations, scholars had fixed their attention on the ink. The real breakthrough arrived when scientists learned to read the skin lying beneath it. In 1947, a shepherd's thrown stone opened the cave. In 2020, DNA finally revealed what those scrolls had spent more than 2,000 years waiting to tell us. And the story is nowhere near finished. If this has captured your interest, be sure to subscribe and switch on notifications. Countless mysteries remain buried inside history, and we are only just beginning to pull them into the light.